So, Don, thanks for doing this. So we're going to talk about One Man's Africa, the book.
Right, yeah.
And first of all, just tell us a bit more about why the book. I know that it started with talks you gave at Probus and stuff, and I think that also you wanted to address some of the misperceptions people have about Africa and particularly its colonial past. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that is true. There's no doubt in talking to people, many of them have very little idea what life was actually like in the colonies, particularly for the white people who worked for the government and companies as well. So yes, that was certainly a part of it. Another part of it was that Lonhro took over Holt's, which was quite a small private family business, and the story of how, with the backing of Lonhro, Holt's became probably the second biggest player in Nigeria, second only to UAC and Unilever, into a group of companies, 15 different activities spread into 3 divisions, and nobody else seems to have ever put this down on paper. If they have, I haven't seen it. And I rather wanted to do it for my own satisfaction as much as anything, while I could still remember it. So that is certainly a part of it. And also, as you say, I gave a series of talks, and people said, oh, that would make a book. And I'd already done a few scribblings about my early life, so I incorporated some of that and really took it from there. That's how the book came to be written, but it was really only ever intended for friends and family, and of course that's as far as it's got.
Right. And when you've given the talks, have people been surprised by things you said? And if so, what were the surprises?
I think they've been surprised, certainly by some of the things I've said about colonial life and how the colonies, the West African colonies particularly, how they came into being, and the sort of regime or life that was established there, which was so different to other parts of Africa, principally in as much that there were no white settlers. People didn't want to live there, raise families there. It wasn't, everything was against it. The climate, tropical diseases, the local population didn't want it. So that's what made it rather different from the rest of Africa. You've worked in Africa, people automatically assume it's either East Africa or even more so South Africa. They have really little conception that West Africa was that much different. Mm-hmm.
Different in a sort of social, colonial social way, do you mean? Are you talking about how the British acted or ran things?
Well, that was the essential difference. Right from day one, it was decreed that the countries in West Africa would not be turned over en masse to the whites for agricultural purposes, which is what happened particularly in East Africa, where I believe after the First World War they were encouraging Europeans to go out there who could buy land for £10 an acre, and that's how these big colonial estates developed. There was never anything like that in West Africa, not at all. Obviously some companies were bigger than others, UAC particularly, but Yeah, that was the principal difference,
Right.
that there was no understanding of West Africa as opposed to the remainder of Africa.
So turning to you, and you as a 21-year-old, when you first considered this, going to Africa, how sophisticated was your knowledge of Africa at 21?
Non-existent, basically. I thought Accra, the capital of the Gold Coast, was a town on the coast of Israel, which is spelt very similarly, but I think it's Acre, is it pronounced? Yeah. So that was
So you had.
I didn't know the first thing about West Africa, and I certainly wasn't aware of the difference, which I've just described, between East Africa and West Africa. I wasn't aware of that difference. So when I had this 1 month in Unilever House telling me about what life was like there, I did sort of wonder what exactly I'd let myself in for, because it wasn't the. I mean, I had very little. I had no conception of colonial life, but from books one reads, you sort of get the impression that it was all very high-level stuff if you were working in the colonies, whereas West Africa really wasn't like that at all. We were just there to do a job and come home when it was time to come home. Yeah.
So had you even read books when you were a lad about Africa, or
Only the books that everyone reads about Africa, John Buchan, mainly, and King Solomon's Mines, Rider Haggard, stories of the Foreign Legion in the desert and all that sort of thing. Only the books that everybody had read about Africa. I don't think anybody had actually written books for the general public about West Africa, because there wasn't very much interesting to write about.
And you were going to work with Africans, and I think England in that period, there were very few black faces around, certainly no Africans. You probably never met an African, I assume, before you went to Africa.
Not really, no. The first time I saw a black man was during the war when the American troops arrived in Thame. I'd never seen a black man except on the movies until then. I realised that we would be working very much with black people, with Africans, but that was all part of the game as far as I was concerned.
And did the training you got at Unilever House, was that comprehensive? Was it sufficient for
it was. Yes, it was. It was familiarisation rather than instruction.
Right. What sort of things did they tell you?
How the business was set up, how it was run, what we might be expected to do. Health, obviously, they gave us a lot of attention, discussion about looking after ourselves and warning us that we could find ourselves in less than congenial situations, and that we were free at any time during that month to get up and walk out if we wanted to.
Right. So having had that preparation, were you nervous on your way to Africa? Were you excited? What was the feeling?
Strangely enough, I was not. I couldn't get there quick enough. I was just absolutely thrilled to bits about the whole idea. I had no idea what was in front of me, of course, none whatsoever. But no, I mean, to me, it was just one huge adventure that I was embarking on.
Right.
And I was prepared for any eventuality.
Before that, your ambition was always to go into the army and succeed in the army. And you were invalided out with your injury. Tell me about you as a soldier. How did you see yourself as a soldier? Were you ready to go to war and fight for your country?
Well,
and
remember
so
that
on?
I was 16 years old when I joined, and although I was certainly keen on making the army a career, how can I put it? I think I was aware of what the possibilities were. I mean, the war was over, so it wasn't as though I was anticipating getting into sort of armed combat at a fairly early stage. I simply looked upon it as I looked upon going to West Africa, as a career, and I would deal with every situation as it arose.
And the hope would be you'd rise through the ranks as a
Well,
an officer.
that was my sincere hope. I didn't realise what the opportunities were until I was actually there. But having, fortunately, had the advantage of going to a decent grammar school, we did get sort of singled out and fast-tracked, if that's the word, and the opportunity was there to possibly get a commission if you were one of the fortunate few. By no means beyond my dreams that I would have got that far. But the possibility was there, and I would certainly have worked towards it.
Right. So, do you think, I mean, were you a very good boy soldier? Would you have been a good soldier, do you
I think I would, yes. I've never found it difficult to accept discipline and rules and regulations. And in a very limited sort of way, when I've had to take responsibility, I suppose I've done so. So in that regard, yeah, and many aspects of the army appealed to me. The organisation, the uniforms, chance to show off, you know. When you're 16, those things are important.
Absolutely. And looking back now, do you think you were lucky that your career went in another direction?
I think I was very lucky.
Really?
Yeah, I think I was very lucky indeed. Yes, I've often thought about this very seriously, and absolutely no hesitation, because in retrospect, I would not particularly have wanted to spend 20 years in the ranks of the army.
Right.
So yes, it was a fortunate mishap that I left the army when I did, in my opinion.
Okay. So you arrived. So you got out of the army. You went back to Hereford for a while, I think, didn't you?
Yes, I went. As you know, my parents were divorced. When I left the army, I went to live with my mother, but the opportunities in rural Oxfordshire were a bit limited. And when my father, who lived in Hereford, said, would I like to go and live there for a while? Not because I was closer to him than my mother, very much the reverse, but I did think it would open up a new mainstream for me, work-wise. So yes, so that was why I went to live in Hereford and got a job there.
And that's the other, when you think about your career as forks in the road, you were working for the lighting company.
Yeah.
What would have happened if you'd stayed in Britain, do you think?
Well, that is the unknown question, isn't it? And who can possibly even begin to suggest what might have happened? I have no idea. I had a good job, an interesting job. I know the company thought quite well of me. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't a qualified engineer, so I was never going to rise. Well, it was very unusual if I'd risen to a great height there. But I mean, these things do happen, but I'm not suggesting that they would have done in my case.
Yeah. We'll get back to Africa in a minute, but we've got to talk about meeting the love of your life, which was at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I've always been fascinated by how Pauline was encouraged or whatever to join you and come to Africa.
Well,
was that easy, or was it a struggle?
Pauline knew that I'd always wanted to travel. I made no secret about that, and although we were very good friends, we weren't nowhere near sort of getting engaged or anything like that. For the simple reason that I was earning £7 a week, and you know, how do you get married on £7 a week when you're 21, 22? So for that reason alone, we didn't take it too seriously. But I told her that I was looking for jobs abroad. At one time I applied to join the Hong Kong police, and had a successful interview with the Crown agents who did the recruitment for the colonial police at that time. And then suddenly they suspended recruitment. And I think, as I put in the books, a colleague at work, an elder colleague, said, well, you know, plenty of British companies have jobs abroad for people. There's almost that, you can have a look at that. And that was how I just came to apply for the job in West Africa, not knowing what company it was or what the job was. I think at 21 you're not too bothered about that if you're looking for a new career. You know, what it wasn't the essential matter. The essential thing was to get a job abroad somewhere.
Right. So you left, and you were kind of dating Pauline when you left.
Yes.
And then you corresponded.
And we wrote to one another, and I tried to explain life to her, and we corresponded throughout that time. I came home on leave. I got leave after I'd been there 21 months, something like that. And we spent a lot of time together. And I tried to explain to the best of my ability what was involved, everything else. And I asked her if she felt that she would like to be part of that sort of life, and she was up for it.
Wow. And what about her parents and family and so? Were they supportive?
They were horrified.
Really?
Oh, absolutely horrified.
Just imagine. I just imagine that.
Absolutely. Well, even my mother thought she was unlike to see me again, because she sent me to the village photographer to have that photograph that's in the book, have that taken, because she said, well, I don't know whether I'll ever see you again. So you can imagine now how Pauline's parents felt. But
she didn't have to be cajoled by you to go. She was up for the adventure.
She was pretty well up for it. So yeah.
That's great. And what about when you got there? Was it? Had you described it accurately, or was she horrified when you got there?
It was a pretty steep learning curve, put it that way.
Tell me more. What do you mean by that?
Well, apart from the first year I spent in a fairly remote place, and but then I went to Kumasi, which was a big city. So probably the freshest thing in her mind, and my mind, was the time I'd spent in Kumasi, where we had all mod cons, and there were things to do, and life was on a pretty even keel. But of course, having got married and having sort of been confirmed as a manager at the end of my first tour, I got posted to some fairly remote town out in the bush, where things weren't quite as well organised, shall we say. Like there was no running water. We were entirely dependent on the rainfall, the rain that we caught off the roof and directed into a big tank underneath the bungalow was up on stilts, and there was a big tank, which formed the veranda. And when we arrived in the middle of the dry season, the fellow I was taking over from said, "I'm awfully sorry that there's a crack in the tank and it's empty." So for the first 3 months, we were taking water straight out of the river, trying not to look too closely at what was going on 50 yards upriver and what people were doing in the river and so on, and taking the water back to our bungalow and boiling it, filtering it several times before drinking it. And that was Pauline's introduction to West Africa.
But I get that, as a young man, ex-army, you're sort of up for the adventure. It's always just amazed me that Pauline...
I know, it amazed me as well. Why she didn't sort of say, "I want to go home," within the first 4 weeks, I'll never know. But there you are, she stuck it out.
Yeah. And because during the day, you'd have work, you were off doing all your things.
At work.
What was her life at that time, in that bungalow without water? I'm just trying to imagine what she was, how she spent her days when she first got there.
Well, she was always a person that was fairly happy with her own company. She could always find things to do. She undertook a lot of although we did have a servant, she did undertake a lot of the work herself. And I think she did virtually all the cooking. So it very much wasn't like two newlyweds playing house, really.
Were there other expats there?
Oh yes. We were in a community. Dunkor was a community of about 100 expats. So, and there were plenty of other wives there. So yes, if she wanted to meet with the others for coffee or ladies' tennis or that sort of thing, she was able to do so. But I don't think she ever found time hanging on her hands. She was always fairly active and things to do.
Which, on that socialising thing, you and the other guys that had trained with you, that sort of that class of, was there sort of loyalty amongst you guys, or were you competing with each other for the best jobs?
No, there was no competition whatsoever. And we all got sent to totally different places. I think there were 15 of us on the course. Only 3 of us went to the Gold Coast. All the rest I think all of them went to Nigeria. One may have gone to Sierra Leone. And we all dispersed as sort of trainees to various departments or districts within the organisation. The two guys who, as it happened, went to the Gold Coast with me. We did all become great friends because we'd lived in a hotel together in London for a month, so we knew one another already. And again, by circumstance, when I got posted to Kumasi after the first year, both of them were in Kumasi at the same time. So we really had a really very, very good time, and we remained friends for a long time.
The people in that class of 15, you said? 15?
About 15.
Were you typical? I mean, you were a grammar school boy from Italian.
Most of them were public school. And I was by far the youngest. The age they were asking for was 22 to 28, and I was only 21 when I applied. I was 22 by the time I got out there, but I was by far the youngest. And most of them were guys who had, I think the majority, several had been to university, several had done national service and been commissioned. Others were working in the city, insurance, stockbroking, that sort of thing. Yeah, so no, I was very much not typical of the...
And that time the class structure was more rigid. Did you feel that class?
Not in the least, no, I didn't. No.
So you weren't made to feel like the oik of the country?
Oh no, absolutely not. Yeah, there were 2 or 3 others who had been to decent grammar schools and so on. But...
and why, you were the youngest and you didn't have experience beyond the army and your brief spells in other jobs. What was it about you? Why did you get picked? Have you any idea?
Not really, other than a lot of the others moaned about having to go into the army, and they thought national service was a total waste of time. We're really talking now about 2 lots of selection, because first of all, I had before I started this month's 4 weeks induction course, before that there was a selection. They said it wasn't competitive because they said we're looking for a number of people, but that was also about 15, 16 people, of whom only 3 were offered jobs. And as I say, most of those also were public school, and the same sort of background that I just described. Then, having started the induction course with again 15 people who had been through the same process as me in other parts of the country, the same applied. I was the youngest and not exactly far from it, the odd man out, not at all.
But again, I'm asking you to be immodest here. What was it about you, do you think, that they liked?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I was so taken by surprise. The very first interview, which to some extent it was competitive, and I remember we were in a horseshoe like that, arranged alphabetically. So I was at the far end, and the 3 or 4 people who were doing this, running the group interview, said, well, I'm going to ask each of you to stand up in turn and give us a resume of your life to date and your hopes for the future, and we'll start with Mr. Wood, because I was the very, very first. You know, you have those moments, I wish I wasn't here, sort of thing. And I simply stood up and said exactly what I've said to you. I'd always wanted to travel. I was disappointed that I hadn't made a career in the army. I didn't profess to know very much about Africa or the company that I was applying for, but I was willing to learn, and I'd like to go. And sat down. 2 or 3 of the others who came after me made a point of saying, one of them particularly, who had been in the Army Education Corps, and he said he had, of course, taught for the examination taken by the first applicant. There was an army exam called the Army Special Certificate of Education, and which you had to have to progress any further. He had taught for that, so.
Well, you did well. So let's get back to Africa and your arrival. And actually, you mentioned your boss. Is it Claude?
My first boss, yeah. Claude Staffier. Yeah.
So what was the relationship there with you and Claude? It seemed to be like a very good one.
Well, I was his boss. Sorry, he was my boss. The first thing he said, I hope you like it in Akusi, the place we're going to, he said, the last one they sent me lasted for 6 weeks. And decided that was enough of Africa. He said, but we'll see how we go. But he was a very decent sort of chap. A bit old school. I think he had joined the company just before the war, when he was in his early 20s, and he was conscripted into the Gold Coast Regiment, and commissioned, as most Europeans were. So he had been through the war in Burma, had a fairly hard time. He was a bachelor, and he in many ways, although he was my boss, he was like a big brother to me. He introduced me to a world about which I knew absolutely nothing. And I was very, very fortunate in having somebody like him. And he gave me specific things to do as soon as he could, to lighten the load a bit.
So I can understand, and you've said in the book how you learn the specifics of how to trade and the details of the job. What about details of just thriving in Africa? This rather alien environment you were in. Was he your mentor for that as well?
Yes, yes, he was. He helped me to engage a steward, a cook steward, to look after me. And yes, he helped me in every conceivable way. But at the same time, it all seemed to come very naturally to me. So it wasn't as though I was sort of running to him for every little thing. I'd looked after myself. You learn to look after yourself in the army. So yeah, he was very helpful, but he didn't have to nanny me, if you know what I mean.
But you just that one thing that you said there. He helped you find a steward. As a 22-year-old, I would have had no idea how to behave with my steward. No. So,
and in a place like Akusi, where we were, where there were so few Europeans, there were very, very few domestic servants. They weren't normally, if in Kumasi, you arrive in Kumasi, within 2 hours you've got 20 people at your door wanting a job as a domestic. Nobody. In Akusi, there were none at all. But he obviously passed the word around some of the senior Africans. And this old, fairly elderly man appeared and said that he was one of the night watchmen, with his stick and his lantern, who came at 6 o'clock every morning for a 12-hour stint. But he said many years ago he had been steward for an officer in the Foreign Legion up in the northeast, the famous northeast corner of Nigeria, Fort Lamy, and he had done a bit of cooking and everything. And he said he'd come. He would look after me. So I took him on at, I think, £5 a month, something like that.
But this was you think about that again. This is because I've never experienced this. Here's a man who's older than you, knows a lot more than you do about the country and so on. But you have to take on a master-servant relationship.
Yeah.
Did you base that on the army, or
pretty well? Yes, and watching other people. I lived with Saf for a few days, so I observed how he dealt with his domestic staff, and it was all. He didn't really have to do much. I had a very basic sort of flat above the office, so all he had to do was buy laundry and open a few tins. There was no fresh produce where we were living, so everything, virtually everything, came out of a tin.
But cleaning and all that stuff, cleaning the apartment, he would have done that.
Yeah. And he was a very good laundryman, having worked for this officer in the Foreign Legion. All these my shorts were so stiff with starch, you sort of stood them up and stepped into them.
The thing, what I'm getting at, what I'm interested in is, and I think for an audience, we're trying to talk to your grandchildren or even their children if they want to know this. So they would not. They'd be wondering about sort of social equality. Whether you and your African steward are on a different social strata. Well, how that works.
It is difficult to describe, but really you've got to turn the clock back 50 years, 100 years back from the time I was in then. The gulf was absolutely infinite. Was the only word for it.
The gulf between you and him.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
at that time, that's the way it was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know, in fact, when I was in Africa with you, I remember having conversations with you about servants, because I'd never experienced it. And you told me about the difference between the people who had servants, how different people treated servants in different ways. And you said that some of the African masters were the cruelest, or the...
Oh, very much so. I mean, every African domestic servant would rather work for a European than for one of his own people. Mm. I think we probably treated them better.
Mm. And what does that mean, treat them better? How does that show itself?
More consideration, more consideration for their welfare, that is. The way we spoke to them. Generally, the way that we tended to treat them better, I would say.
Was there trust, mutual trust, between you and
your staff?
Steward?
It varied. We never had a bad experience with domestic staff. I knew many, many Europeans who had horrendous stories with domestic staff, because there has to be a certain amount of trust. You go to the office in the morning, leaving your steward in the house to clean up and lock up, and you hope that everything will be there when you get back. Mm-hmm. But I have known many cases when people have done exactly that, gone to work, left the steward, and they get home, and the steward is gone and the house is empty. Mm. It's happened, believe me. We never had an experience like that. Both Pauline and I think, were always very caring for our staff. In terms, we paid them well. We didn't expect them to work outrageous hours, like unless by advance arrangement and so on. We gave them regular time off. We paid them when we went on leave, which a lot of people didn't do. And I think for those reasons we probably did. We avoided having a bad experience. I mean, the one servant particularly, as you well know, Adamu, we had for 12 years while we were in Nigeria. Before that, we'd never had anyone for a long period of time. They tended to come and go, you know. They would fall out with you, or you would fall out with them, or they would get family pressure to go back to their village, or all sorts of things. We had one for about 3 years, 4 years maybe, but most of the time they came and went. Yeah.
In your later years in Africa, I know, because I remember it, you had peers who were Africans, professional peers, and you had you socialised with Africans.
Oh yes.
Did you see was there a change? Is that geography that changed it, or time?
Time, I would say.
Yeah.
Because when I first went to the Gold Coast, I would say it didn't happen.
Right.
In Nigeria, in the 70s and 80s, it started to happen. Mm-hmm. It started to happen. Yeah. It never became a regular thing, though. We tended, when I say socialising to the point of home invitations was still pretty limited. Mm-hmm. Socialising in the clubs and where there are lots of people, absolutely no trouble at all. Mm-hmm. But I mean, normally you don't invite people for purely social purposes to your house, even in this country or in America or anywhere, unless you are on fairly friendly terms with them. And it would even, at the time I left Africa, it was still unusual, I would say, to be friendly to that extent. Having said that, I can think of 3 or 4 people that, yes, we were sufficiently friendly with them and liked them enough to socialise and ask them to our house. But I would say that was somewhat the exception.
Right.
Somewhat the exception.
It would have been scandalous, but were there ever examples of single white guys having relations with black Africans, for instance?
Well, let's deal with that one. Because when I first arrived in the Gold Coast, and I was talking to staff about the servant situation, he said, "We'll find you a steward for you." I said, "Yeah, okay, fine. How do you manage?" He said, "I've got a girlfriend who comes in and looks after me." So I thought, this bloke's got it made. He's living here up country, miles from anywhere, and there are white girls so that he can have that sort of arrangement. Of course, staying with him for a few days, I quickly realised that he did have a permanent girlfriend who was live-in, who he had been with for 7 or 8 years. They didn't have children. And I also discovered that for people of his generation, it was not the norm, but not unknown. There were half a dozen very senior managers in UAC at that time in the Gold Coast who were in similar relationships.
With local African women?
With local African women. Several of whom I met, all of whom were educated, charming, delightful people.
Right.
No problem at all. Ellen, who was Staff's girlfriend, she was absolutely great. And she taught me more about Africa than he did, you know. But then, come independence, the senior management in Unilever felt that these unofficial relationships were not a very good representation of the company's senior management. And staff and the other half dozen were all told that it would be a very good idea if they were actually to get married to these ladies, which I believe most of them did. Staff did.
So the objection wasn't the race, the objection was they're not married.
Not married.
Well,
And of course, going back pre-war, before the war, I would say it was absolutely the norm, because there were very, very few European wives in West Africa, among the government or the commercial companies. Very few white women were there. So yeah, that was the arrangement.
well,
So what happened when they went back, say when they retired and went back to Britain? Did they take...
I don't know what happened in every situation, but Staff and Ellen retired to the Caribbean. I think it was Jamaica, I'm not sure. But Staff died very young, very shortly after he retired, he died. What happened to Ellen, I've no idea.
And they didn't have children?
As far as I know, there were no children, no.
Yeah.
so moving on from sex to violence. One of the other things that always fascinated me is your personal safety, and all the time you're in Africa. You didn't get murdered. You didn't, as far as I know, you survived without too much thing. But were you at risk? Is your personal safety at risk? Well, any time, early days or all the way through?
I never really thought so, but at the same time, I was aware of the dangers and took steps to avoid them. Certainly in the Gold Coast, the early days, there was really no threat at all, I would say. The West Africans were not in the main resentful of us being there. As I said, they would prefer to work for a white man than a black man, whether it was in the house or in the company or the government department. They'd much prefer to work for a white man. So the risk of sort of attack from a disgruntled employee was non-existent, I would say.
But what about would have been a huge wealth gap between, I realise you weren't that rich, but there was still a wealth gap.
There was opportunist robbery all the time. If you gave the opportunity for it, it was there. No doubt about it. Open armed, but there was very, very little in the early days. Very little violent robbery. They'd rob your house while you weren't there, but the idea of breaking into the house while you were there and threatening you, maybe hurting you, in the course of robbery, that didn't happen.
And you talked about in those early days travelling with £40,000 in an iron chest and so on.
Yeah.
Again, you had a policeman with you, I think, but
no.
Oh, you didn't?
Oh, going down to the bank.
Yeah.
Yes, when I went to the bank in a car from Akusi, yes, I'd have a policeman with me then.
But then, was that a risky thing to do or no?
Not really. No. I never felt any risk anyway.
It's amazing. I mean, the fear of crime is one of those things that's everyone has it here in England.
Yeah.
You know, for you to go be without that fear is remarkable.
I mean, you leave a bag of one of those cash bags outside the office door and walk away, someone will pick it up.
Of course.
But you carry it out there, they're not going to hit you on the head and take it.
Right. And did you ever worry about leaving Pauline alone in the house? I suppose she wasn't alone. She would have had some staff there, I guess.
Again, we always took precautions. The house was always well looked up and locked up. I mean, during the mornings, the staff would be there. That she would be by herself all afternoon unless she was going out somewhere, and she would lock the house securely. Daylight break-ins were, even in Nigeria, were fairly rare.
What about when you had to travel, when you went away on your own and left Mum?
That was
on her own for
a bit worrying, but she was, as I say, the house was so well secured. We always took care of that. We had servants that we could trust, as far as it goes. We had watchmen at the house, and we had a dog. So we took every precaution that we could. But yes, I was always a little bit concerned. But she didn't seem to be too unhappy about it.
She didn't suggest that perhaps she go with you?
No.
Not stay there on her
No.
own? She wasn't scared?
No. No.
One of the surprises of the book it was that I had never realised you had been sworn in as a temporary assistant superintendent in the police reserve. Did you get a uniform?
No, I got an armband. and I only got called out once, when they were having elections, and the DC, who was an African district commissioner, said, would I mind going to one of the polling places and just standing there, but nothing happened.
Excellent. So let's bring you forward to Penny's birth, which I think is an important moment. Pauline went home. That's right. Was that right? For your birth. and had the baby, but then brought the baby back quite soon, back to Africa.
No, it didn't quite work like that. We had got things timed to perfection, we thought. Towards the end of my tour, Pauline was pregnant, and the idea was that she would fly home to have about 2 months before the baby was born, and I would follow about 6 weeks later, so that I was just there 2 weeks before the baby was due to be born. And then my boss phoned me one day to say, you're due to go on leave in first week of April, aren't you? I said, yeah, that's right. And he knew Pauline very well. He became a very good friend, actually. He said, well, I'm sorry, I've got some bad news. The guy who's taking over from you, David Belbin, has resigned. I said, okay, so who's coming in his place? He said, there isn't anyone available at the moment. So he said, I'm afraid you're going to have to delay your leave.
You're laughing as you tell this story, but it sounds bloody awful.
Well, it was bloody awful. It was terrible. But, you know, what do we do? It's my employer.
Did you ever think about disobeying him and jacking it in?
Well, I would have had to have resigned, and then I have to give notice anyway, and the company could have taken all sorts of. I mean, I suppose, I don't know. I don't want to give the impression of I had the wrong sort of priorities, but we always, particularly in the Gulf, had an intense feeling of loyalty to the company, and if there was a way round the situation, we'd find it, you know. And Pauline was staying with her mother at the time, so it wasn't exactly. It was difficult, but it wasn't exactly the end of the world. So that's what happened. So I eventually went on leave. They dug somebody up, and Penny was 3 months old when I eventually got to England. So, and because I'd done a long tour by this time, I got a long leave. So we were in England until, I think, December. We were going through the photographs, weren't we? So Penny would have been probably 8-9 months old when she first went to Africa.
And I've always, as an employer, when my staff got pregnant and they told me what their plans are, I always used to say, look, you have no idea what you're going to do, because when the baby arrives, you know, things change. But did the baby's arrival change in that, you know, was Pauline ever reluctant to go back to Africa with a baby?
No, not at all.
Right.
No, it was all part of the deal. Right. You know, we would have children, the children would come back to Africa.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, you know, the whole thing about the health, the climate, and so on of that region. Were you nervous, both of you, about having a child there?
Not really, provided you took the right sort of precautions, which Pauline was meticulous about. There was no reason why a baby shouldn't do well, and Penny thrived out there.
What precaution, as in like hygiene and...
Hygiene, yes. Yeah. Hygiene and jabs and food and everything like that, yeah.
Right. So the other aspect of the book, which I've touched on already, is your progression, your career progression, which actually when the second time I read the book, I realised that you had this very steady progression up through the company. On the postings that you got, did you actually were you in any way engineering your own career, or was it all you were told your next posting is?
Oh, I was told my next posting is, yeah.
Was there anything you could do to influence that really?
No, I don't think so. No.
So a bit like
it was the army. Oh yeah, you were told. Yeah, well you're going to spend the next 2 years in Kumasi. Fine, you know. You're going to spend the next 2 years in Aden. Fine, if you're in the army.
Yeah,
And some postings were better than others, you know.
absolutely. Yeah. And was your rise, thinking back to the others, your friends that you started with,
Yeah.
was your rise exceptional or not? Again, don't be modest. Tell
No,
us
no,
what.
no, not at all. No, on a par.
Because way back you mentioned that when you first got there, your first boss, Claude, had said the last guy only lasted 3 weeks or whatever. So there must have been some that didn't do as well as you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I think that the dropout rate was somewhere between 30 and 50% who went back for a second tour. A tremendous number only did one tour. A lot did 2 tours. They'd get married and the wife didn't like it,
Yeah.
or something like that, so they wouldn't do another tour. But no, it was my progression was no more spectacular than most. Getting the job as DM in Accra, that upset a few people.
Tell me more.
Oh, I suppose I sort of stepped over a few heads.
Because someone spotted potential in you?
Well, I don't know. They just told me that would be my next job.
And how did that manifest itself? That disquiet.
Well, I know that a couple of people who had sort of got 7 or 8 years longer service than me did raise a bit of an objection, but.
Did you have to work with them? Did you have to work with them?
No, not at all. No, they were district managers as well, but in smaller districts.
So eventually you got posted to Nigeria, which is. Was that
Yeah, that was all due to the collapse of the economy in the Gold Coast, or Ghana as it was by then. And there was a bit of a shakeout. There were a lot of redundancies when we got out of general trading. And the 2 people that I mentioned, Tom Campbell and Jimmy McCare and myself, several of the they were other district managers as well, and several of the others, they were just prematurely retired. Elderly guys.
Right. And going to Nigeria, was that a significant difference from any other posting?
Well, it was a complete and utter change from what I'd been doing before,
right.
Because the general trading business was something that stood alone, and buying cocoa, which I'd been doing for so long, that just didn't apply any longer. And I was working for or managing a division within a pharmaceutical company. So it was entirely different, but, like everything else, you got on with it.
Were you given any kind of training to do that?
Not training, no. Familiarisation, yes. I spent 2 or 3 months in this country visiting suppliers, manufacturers, and talking to the people in London office. London office in UAC kept a very, very tight grip on things. We had local general managers, but there were people in London who they really kept their thing. All management postings of Europeans were absolutely controlled by London.
How?
Well, the fact that I became district manager in Accra, that was a London decision. Probably, I know it was on the recommendation of somebody in the Gold Coast. But London could just as easily said, no, not him. him instead. And that happened all the time.
And you reported back to London.
No, I didn't report to London. I reported locally, but management postings were controlled. European management postings were controlled by the people in London. They had the final say, put it that way. And they would have to have pretty strong reasons for disagreeing with the people on the spot in the Gold Coast. But they were not above overruling them and saying, no, we don't think that's right. That man shouldn't be there, this man should be here, that sort of thing.
So we get fast forward to the civil unrest in Nigeria and the start of the civil war, and you then quit. You had to quit.
Yeah.
Tell me about quitting and how was that? Was that a very tough decision? I would think
it was a very tough decision.
Scary?
Not scary, no, not in the well.
For your future, I
mean. A lot of us could see that the situation had developed that couldn't go on. The trouble between the federal government and the states, the three regions as it was in those days, the tribalism, which is what it really came down to, mixed in with the political scene, and there was and because all the European administrators had been withdrawn from government, things were starting to wind down in a very big way. And there were a few riots and stuff in Lagos, and there was a strike, so the bins weren't being emptied. Electricity supply became very intermittent. And it was pretty obvious that something had to give. And I was, 32, 3. And I thought, well, if I'm not going to stay here for the rest of my life, this is the time to go. To find something in the UK. Bearing in mind I had 2 small children. So that was why I quit. And Pauline was getting very fed up with Lagos as well, and the hassle that was starting to develop in all respects.
But your hopes for yourself, career-wise, and your hopes for your next lifestyle, did you have anything sort of planned out, or was it a question of just...
Not really. No, I thought, well, I'll just go back to Britain and find something else to do.
Did you assume it would be relatively easy to find another job?
I thought it would. I didn't think it would be easy, but I thought it would be easier than it was. There was a suggestion that I could have a job with UAC in London in a procurement job. I forget which company it was now, but they were producing. Do you remember Treetop's orange squash?
Yes.
In that shaped bottle? Well, apparently this was a new project that they'd set up, and they wanted someone to be responsible for buying sugar and buying oranges and all this sort of thing, glass bottles, and it just didn't appeal to me, to be honest.
To a certain extent you were corrupted because you'd had all these adventures in Africa.
Yeah.
So how the hell do you go back to Britain to settle into a mundane job? Is that, am I reading that right?
Yeah, well, it's a question of alternatives. I thought the longer... I couldn't see things improving in Nigeria at that time, which of course they didn't.
But I'm talking about you as a employee, or I would have been slightly nervous of employing you in Britain at at that time. There's a 32-year-old who spent basically his entire working life doing crazy things in Africa. How is this person going to thrive in a job in England?
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't easy.
Right.
It wasn't easy.
When you arrived in England and then it was your home, you were now back in England. Was everything familiar, or had England changed in your absence?
Oh, it was pretty familiar, to be honest. Right. Yes, I mean, bearing in mind that we were coming home every 18 months or every year, as it became. So we didn't lose touch with friends and things generally. No, it didn't feel strange, really.
Right. And in that time, you had the business, didn't you? Was that the Webley thing?
Well, that was when we went to Webley, yeah.
Which is something you always
just something
skipped over.
I'd rather put that on one side. It did happen. I like to pretend it never did, but there you go.
Okay, well, we'll skip over it then. But then you got a chance to go back to Africa.
Yeah, that's right.
And was that a sort of instant, thank God, I'm going back to Africa?
Not quite like that, but I was very, very pleased at the thought of going back there. Yeah. I realised that going back with a new employer and bearing in mind that Holt's and London, it was a very new development. Nobody had a clue how it was going to work out, because Tiny Road had only taken it over. I think the early 69, or maybe 68. So it was a very new project, but I mean, Pauline and I had a long talk about it for a long while, because it was a major decision, a far greater decision than going out there the first time.
Why?
Well, because when I went up by myself, if it had all gone pear-shaped after 3 months, I could have come home and nobody would have been the worse off. But now I'd got a wife and 2 children and a house in this country. You know, I had responsibilities and obligations. So I suppose to some extent I was putting that at risk. But there were pluses, no doubt about that.
Did Pauline need persuading to go back, or the other way around? Did you need to be persuaded that it was the right thing?
The other way around. I had to convince or persuade her. But I said I would like to do it if she was up for it, but if she didn't want to go, we'd forget it. And she said, no, let's do it. She said, if you want to do it, we'll go.
Right. Yeah. So you're now back in Africa. The kids going to boarding school, which we've talked about in the past, and you've talked about in the past.
Just Penny.
Penny was in boarding, but then later Andrew went as well.
So Andrew came back to Africa with us because he was only 6. Yeah, that's right. Penny was 11. Andrew was 6.
And was there ever a choice in sending the kids to boarding school? You know, keeping them with you was not really practical.
No, that wasn't an option. We knew that if we went back to Africa, then we would be sending the kids to boarding school. Yes, we knew that. And I have to say, in my case, that was something of an attraction, because I was becoming a bit disconcerted by what was happening in the schools in England. We're talking about the time of Crossland, whose vow was to close every working grammar school in the country, which we all know about. And he did, virtually. So, to me, that was a plus, to be honest, that I could give my kids, I thought, a better education. I'm not saying it was the only thing, or even the most important thing, but I saw it as an advantage.
Right.
And were there no schools in Nigeria, like international schools?
At that time, there were no international schools there was the American school in Lagos, which I think you may know about. But I think it was principally for American pupils. So the whole education system was slanted towards the American way of life, which wasn't much good if you were going to come back to England to work.
So now you're working for Tiny Lonro, and how did it compare, if you like? There's a chapter 1 of your life in Africa. Maybe there are 3 chapters. There's the 3 countries.
Yeah.
So before and then later on in Malawi. But was the type of work or the type of relationships and the ways of working, were they similar when you got
They
back
were
to
very, very similar. The general trading business with UAC and Holtz was very similar. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you thrived again, I think, with your new employer. You did well.
Well, because as soon as Tiny got involved, they started sort of developing, how can I say, expanding and improving the running. It had been a fairly sedate company, very much run by the head of the family, Michael Holt, in Liverpool. Very few of the organisations had in fact, there were no general managers. The job I took on was to be the area manager for 2 companies in the north of England, and basically I reported to a bloke in Liverpool, and there was a fellow in the south of the country doing much the same job as me, and he reported to him as well. So it was totally different, and all that changed, of course. And this pharmaceutical company, West African Drug, the new management in Liverpool said, this is rubbish. You need a local general manager, and he organises the business, and people report to him. So I became the general manager of West African Drug, or managing director as they call us, but I was the general manager of West African Drug, and I did that for 5 years. And yeah, that was good. It worked out well. And I was able to arrange things much on the same line that we organised the business in Nigeria. I split the country into regions, had regional managers, branch managers, and that was the way it worked.
Okay. I'm going to fast forward you to Malawi now. So tell me about that. Tell me about that transition.
I think it's relevant to take a step in between, because Holtz, with the backing of Lonro, was able to expand at a fantastic rate, and became a group of 15 divisions, each with its own general manager, reporting to a local group managing director, which is the way it should have been from day one. And that was all working very, very well indeed. But the group general manager, or the group MD, didn't want 15 general managers reporting to him. So it was split into 3 separate divisions. The motors business, by this time we'd developed a very big, strong relationship with Yamaha, We put up a plant, we were producing 6,000 motorcycles a month. So the companies were divided up into 3 groups of 5, and I took over one of those groups as I was called Divisional Chief Executive. We had 3 divisions, so you've got the 3 divisional managers, which I was one, reporting into the group MD. So, and I had 5 general managers reporting to me, and that worked very, very well indeed. Gave me a sort of insight into wider management rather than just managing a single company, as to taking it one stage further beyond that. So that was how the Malawi thing happened.
Mm-hmm. Was when the Malawi opportunity came up, or when I don't know, was it a posting, or again, was it something you tried to, you knew about?
What certainly wasn't a job I looked for, I can tell you.
Because you went there and advised them against it.
Yeah. It started with Banda, the president of Malawi, saying to Tiny Rowland that this group of companies within the Malawi Development Corporation was losing money, and he didn't quite know what to do about it. And he said he knew that Tiny Rowland got an interest in West Africa. So had he got any suggestions? So Tiny said, well, we'll send someone down and have a look. So I was told to go down there and look at the different companies and take an accountant with me. I took Ola Yusuf, who gave you the cover. So Ola and I went down there, and he looked through the books, and I sort of looked at the operations on the ground. And as you say, I thought that, yeah, lovely country, lovely people, but there's a war going on 3 sides of the country. We've already lost the railway line to the Indian Ocean to bring goods in and export our tea and tobacco, and that's not going to end anytime soon. So it's very obvious that this is not going to be an easy thing to do, which is what I said. But for reasons that I don't know, the directors of Longo said that, yeah, we ought to be involved down there.
But my question was, and by the way, you're much more comfortable talking about organisations than yourself, which has come through. My question was you, and whether you welcomed this, whether this was an exciting new adventure.
I wrote a fairly long, not too long, but a longish report, saying how I saw it on the ground, and saying that I didn't really think that this was a good economic opportunity for us to get involved in, because. So then I went back to the office, and Peter, about 10 days later, Peter Best, you remember Peter? Mm-hmm. Peter Best phoned me from London to say, yeah, well, the board have considered all the things you say, and they do understand your cautious attitude, but we see this as something we should do as an opportunity. And as you seem to have identified most of the problems, we think you should go down there and run it.
So the third time I'm going to ask the question, what was your feeling about it? Did you want to go to Malawi? Was it a good adventure? Was it something you welcomed?
I suppose it was.
So we're recording again. So we're coming to Malawi, and you were telling us that you had another conversation with Pauline. And what did you tell her about Malawi?
I told her it was a very, very attractive country with nice people. A lot of the problems that we were experiencing in Nigeria from a social point of view, robbery and difficulties in that respect, didn't really exist in Malawi. but it would be a question of going for 3 years rather than finishing in 18 months' time when I was due to retire. But again, she said, yeah, why, let's go. I mean, if she had said she didn't want to go, I would have said, I could have just said sorry and could have stayed in Nigeria.
Were you looking forward to retirement at that time, or did you want to keep working?
I think I was looking forward to retirement, yeah. I mean, if you remember, the late 80s were a pretty good period in England. Mrs. Thatcher had sorted out a number of the previous problems, so life did seem to be quite good in this country. Mm-hmm. So we were quite keen to come back and become involved in that. And of course, children were growing up. Penny was married. You had Tom by that time. Andrew had just got married or was about to get married. So, yeah, we were looking forward to coming back to England. But adding a bit of that time on was all right. And, of course, when the 3 years was up, they said they would like me to stay for another 3 years, which I did. So, and again, Pauline was totally relaxed about that. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the second 3 years, we were certainly ready to come home. Yeah. We were both, well, I was 50, 59, 58, nearly 59. So yes, we both felt that this was the time to come back to England.
Mm-hmm. And so that brings us to the end of Africa. And I've got one last question. You are a memoir writer now, someone who's put his life down in words, which kind of indicates that you're a little bit proud of your life. You think it's interesting enough to record. How do you want to be remembered as a man in Africa?
I remember you once saying that the epitaph on my gravestone should be, he made a decent gin and tonic. I think I'd be quite happy with that, actually. Or, of course, Spike Milligan. I think I'd probably prefer his. I think he wanted to put on his gravestone, I told you I was ill.
But now you quoted me and Spike. Now I'm more interested in how you see things. It's very difficult. It is very difficult for you to think about yourself. And
I can only say what I actually put in. I think the first part of the book. I'll never forget a lady called Catherine Whitehorn, who was a fairly well-known journalist and writer. She said that the secret of a successful career is finding out what you like doing best and then getting someone to pay you for doing it. And just taking that in isolation, I had a good career.
And and you're proud of your achievements?
I could have done better. I suppose I could have done a lot worse, but I'm not totally dissatisfied, put it that way.
Okay. And finally, is there a question or questions that I haven't asked that I should have done?
Not really, I can't think of any. Penny?
I have a question. Were you ever homesick for England?
Don't think so. No. Because I always knew that within a few months I would be back there anyway. I knew it was.
But the lifestyle, the English lifestyle, you didn't miss that? No,
I didn't. No, I think I've always been reasonably good at making the best of what was available.
So likewise, when you came back here, because I do remember you and Mum talking about the possibility of retiring to South Africa.
Yes.
When you came back, retired to England, did you miss that African way of life? Were you homesick ever for that?
No, I wouldn't say I missed it. It was a period that I enjoyed, but it was over, and we were now in another situation. And in the main, because I've got happy memories about Africa, I'm quite happy to live with those memories. Certainly I remember the good times, and I'd love to live them again. But you have to be at a certain age to do it, and I'm past that age. So, really, no huge regrets about anything.